Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to look at another cluster or type of narcissism known as the Paranoid Narcissist. Since there's so much to cover on this topic, we'll break this up into 2 episodes. In part 1, this video, we will begin to look at some of the descriptive criteria. In other words, what are the characteristics that define this particular type of narcissism? And then to make this come alive, I will give you a fictitious example of how this presents itself. And then we want to look at what is the cause, like what are the origins of this type of narcissistic behavior? And in order to do that, we need to look at a particular theory. In my opinion, when thinking about what causes something, it's always good to have a theory in mind. And there are many different theories of what causes somebody to become a certain way, but we're going to look at just one today. And then if time allows, we'll get into the details of how one can relate to somebody like this if you have this kind of person in your life. Okay, so what are the typical traits of the paranoid narcissist? The paranoid narcissist exhibits all the hallmark traits of narcissism, including, and most importantly, the grandiose sense of self. What that means is what? There's an excessive need for attention, admiration, and because this becomes so important to them, there's a sense of entitlement. They feel like they deserve to be treated this way. They deserve to be fed the meal. If you might remember, if you looked at my prior video on the craving covert narcissist. So there's a sense of entitlement. And since they're entitled, as you can imagine, they have very little empathy for other people, right? Because the most important thing becomes gratifying, a gratification of their needs. They tend to exploit people in order to get these needs of theirs met. And in short, overall, this is what in psychoanalytic language we would call the reunion or the blissful reunion of oneself and other. This is the magical, blissful reunion of the grandiose self and the omnipotent other. What that means is simply, if you could picture this image, the baby cries and the breast appears. And I'm using the word breast symbolically, of course. There are many other characteristics, and I could keep going on, but I trust that you're familiar with all the different characteristics of the narcissist. So let's focus in particular on some of the characteristics of the paranoid narcissist. Layered upon all these classical narcissistic characteristics, there's a distinct and pronounced sign of paranoia. In other words, there's an incredible amount of suspiciousness amongst these individuals. And I want to be clear, the individuals that I'm referring to today are not overtly psychotic. Many of these people can live at least semi-productive lives at work. Relationships are a little bit harder for them to maintain, but even that is possible. So what do we see specifically with the paranoid narcissist? Is there is an excessive and irrational level of distrust of others. There's a constant vigilance for potential threats or for being betrayed. There's a tendency to interpret innocuous comments as if there were covert signs of betrayal or that somebody is out to harm them. And one thing that I really want to highlight, and we'll come back to this when we start thinking about the treatment approach. Well, what I call this a treatment approach because I have the mind of a clinician. This is what we want to keep in mind in terms of thinking about how you could relate to somebody like this in your life, is that there's an enormous amount of contempt and devaluation. And although this is utilized by all the different clusters or types of narcissistic individuals or narcissism, right, or narcissists, this requires careful attention and consideration if we are to gain a deeper understanding of the paranoid narcissistic individual. Now, one other thing I want to mention here, and again, we'll come back to this, I'm just laying down some groundwork, is we have two things. One, what we call the purified pleasure ego, and that's an important concept to keep in mind, again, when we're thinking about being with these people, the purified pleasure ego, and something that's called the blissful reunion, okay? But we'll come back to that. I'm just planting a seed. Let's get right into an example. Here's a fictitious case of a fellow John. Let's consider John a middle-aged man with pronounced paranoid narcissistic tendencies. He becomes fixated and he perceives any irregularities, such as colleagues at work arriving late or leaving early or seemingly having a lighter workload than him. He has any irregularities he tends to perceive as threats, right? That somebody is doing something to him. So there's a cycle that begins to develop where there's this constant vigilance. In other words, at work, he's constantly watching the comings and goings of all of his colleagues. This leads him to feel incredibly frustrated because, again, in his mind, like many paranoid individuals, somebody is taking advantage of him. So there's this vigilance, there's frustration, and then there's dumping. What is dumping? Dumping is what you may have heard of already, which is they go on a smear campaign. So in John's case, what he does is he voices repeated complaints about his colleagues' behavior to his superiors. And despite being advised by his superiors to stay focused on his own work, he can't divert his attention. He's totally engulfed and preoccupied with this. And he's preoccupied with his colleagues getting away with something, with their more leisurely workload. So what ends up happening in this case is John ultimately ends up frustrating his superiors. And despite the warnings, this typically culminates in terminations. And that's terminations with an S, because prior to coming to see me, he was already fired from many jobs. So now we want to think, what are the causes of this type of behavior? Let's look at a little piece of theory. I want to go back to the separation individuation process defined by Margaret Muller, a renowned psychoanalyst. According to the theory and her studies with her research with mother-child dyads, what she came to discover is that when the child has an attentive mother, right, it leads to feelings of security and safety. What's an attentive mother? A mother that is there, more or less, this is what Winnicott calls good enough mothering. It doesn't have to be perfect, but a mother who is more or less there to meet the child's emotional and physical needs, providing a reliable and safe environment, comforting environment, an understanding environment, where there's empathy. Trust begins to develop in this kind of environment. And when trust begins to develop, it allows the developing child to have a capacity for trust, right? Something that you can imagine the paranoid individual lacks, right? So they can begin to trust that their needs are going to be met and they begin to feel safe in the world. But what if the mother is not consistently present, right? What if this mother is preoccupied with her own anxieties, fears, and concerns? This leads to feelings of what? Insecurity and anxiety. As a result, there's a heightened sensitivity to potential threats. This can contribute to developing the paranoid tendencies that I detailed a little bit earlier, because the child grows up with certain fears that the environment is not safe. But what else distinguishes the typical, let's say, the the grandiose or the covert narcissist from the paranoid narcissist. I want to make sure that I leave you with the impression that these are not parents who are simply not just inattentive or preoccupied. See, because those parents, those caregivers may still have the child's best interest in mind. What I've discovered with these individuals is they typically grow up in a family with caregivers who are more hostile or more paranoid themselves. So this is a simple example. The child would fall down and scrape his knee. The parent would respond with something like, "What's the matter with you? Why are you so clumsy? Why are you bothering me with this?" In other words, they send the message to the child that you are a burden. Something is wrong with you. And look what you're doing to me. This is the world of paranoia that they're already in. Compared to other forms of narcissism, these individuals encountered a higher frequency of early betrayals and more intense and overt attacks on their sense of developing self. They are constantly subjected to criticisms, put-downs, harsh judgments. So to return to my earlier example with John, the paranoid man who has a difficult time holding down a job. As a child, we came to discover he was constantly subjected to criticisms, harsh judgments, and unrealistic expectations. As a child, he was often called stupid or lazy, so these were direct attacks on his sense of self. And he always fell short of his father's unrealistic expectations. It wasn't also uncommon for him to receive a smack or two for when he didn't do things, again, according to his father's standards. So what I'm trying to get at is that family aggression sets the stage. This is not a these are the individuals who don't come from families that are harmonious. There's a lot of family conflict and aggression, and the parents or the caregiver's own level of paranoia. Remember, look what you're doing to me. Growing up in this type of environment, you can imagine that one would constantly feel devalued and ashamed for their own very existence. This leads to deep feelings that they carry around into adulthood of shame or inadequacy, and this leads to the development of the paranoid traits. So what I'm saying is feelings of powerlessness, inferiority, helplessness, and being at the mercy of others leads to this paranoid disposition. So again, in the case of John, when memories began to emerge, he remembered his father saying things to him like, when he would do something again that didn't meet up to his father's expectations, "Stop being such a baby. You need to toughen up." Or, "You always make such a big fuss of these things. And you know, it's your fault that you're feeling this way. And why are you bringing this to me anyway? Your sister would deal with this better than you. Why can't you handle this like your sister?" These early experiences are persistent, and that's the key here. Quantity and quality are really important, right? Quality is very intense, that I mentioned already, and the quantity is this is persistent. It's not just the caregiver having a bad day or two, which it would be understandable. So if this becomes chronic enough, it leads to feelings of weakness, shame, and humiliation. And this is where the paranoia comes in. Because the paranoia, if you can imagine, becomes a compensatory way to deal with this. Yes, in other words, the suspiciousness, right? The paranoia, the suspiciousness, looking at his colleagues at work, all of this becomes compensatory. How do feelings of paranoia or suspiciousness cover up feelings of humiliation, shame, and helplessness? This doesn't seem like it makes sense. Let's bookmark it there. As I said, there's a lot more to say, and I'll let you think about that until I come back and we take a good look at video, which will be episode 2 of The Paranoid Narcissist, And at that point, we'll get into how is paranoia compensatory? And then how do we get close and relate? Or how do we treat somebody like this? How do we connect with somebody like this in our lives? Okay, until next time.